different people can have different relationships with this word, with this quality, this emotion. I approach it from a Buddhist perspective, which is a faith-based perspective, but you can have a secular interpretation of compassion or interpret it from your own faith, your own spirituality as well. Compassion to me is when you can offer acknowledgement and love to your suffering or to somebody else's suffering, when you can acknowledge that suffering is a part of life.
Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here today with Aayaan Singh. Aayaan, welcome to What the Fundraising.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Why don't we start with you telling everybody a little bit about you and your work, and then we'll dive into some of the juicy convo we had talked about.
Cool. My name is Aayaan Singh, pronouns he, him. Don't be misled by my youthful looks. I have worked in social justice for almost a decade now. I got an early start. I am currently a liberatory facilitator and a certified leadership coach. I've also been a consultant in the past for big philanthropies in the areas of health equity and climate justice. And I would say that my work, in terms of like my soul work, my purpose, what I'm here to do, is to help people unearth their power and to create more thriving futures for all of us.
I love that. And I remember reaching out to you because I had seen some content somewhere, or maybe it was in your profile on LinkedIn, about your focus on helping people live their missions while showing themselves more self-compassion. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about that, and then we can sort of get into what we talked about there.
Totally. So I think it would be helpful to start by describing what I see as compassion. Different people can have different relationships with this word, with this quality, this emotion. I approach it from a Buddhist perspective, which is a faith-based perspective, but you can have a secular interpretation of compassion or interpret it from your own faith, your own spirituality as well. Compassion to me is when you can offer acknowledgement and love to your suffering or to somebody else's suffering. When you can acknowledge that suffering is a part of life, that's one of the biggest teachings in Buddhism, is that we can never escape suffering as long as we're alive. And I think it also makes a lot of sense in this political moment for a lot of people in the US, grappling with Palestine and just ongoing mass acts of violence that really give us a perspective of like how much suffering there is in the world. And then we also feel it in our own day-to-day lives. So compassion is when you can acknowledge and offer love to suffering, both within yourself and outside of yourself. The way I say it is I help perfectionistic professionals turn into like powerful proponents of their vision. So my work around compassion is because we're unearthing power, and compassion is a key stop on the way.
Okay, I love what you were talking about in terms of suffering and the kind of power and embodiment that is possible when we accept that suffering exists.
Yeah.
And I feel like in capitalism, in the world as it is today, what we're sort of constantly sold is a removal of suffering, right? It's like, buy this thing and this won't hurt anymore. Buy this thing and you won't doubt yourself anymore. Work with me and it will be easy, right? We're constantly being sold these like antidotes of suffering. And I think it leads to then this belief, unless you have maybe a practice where you really have leaned into that acceptance, that life shouldn't be filled with suffering, or it should be easier. And then we sort of like, when we are suffering, push it away, or like, I don't have time for that, or maybe we buy something to make it go away, or whatever it is. And so I'm curious, like, I can imagine that even hearing that for some people, an acceptance of suffering might feel overwhelming to think about or to lean into because it feels like it might consume us, maybe if we let ourselves feel it or have an awareness around it. And I'm curious sort of like how you maybe start the process for folks to be open-hearted to this reality in a world that doesn't really take care of our tender hearts.
Yeah. Oh, I love the way you put it. The world doesn't take care of our tender hearts, and we are sold a lot under capitalism as, antidotes to, oh, like this will take away your suffering. I'm glad you mentioned that because I want us to frame this conversation even as we're, in the personal and interpersonal spheres, like we're talking about our relationships, our day to day work, like tasks we have to do when we're procrastinating, like all these day to day things that come up for us as individuals. I want to remember that we're framing this still, with the big picture in mind. This isn't just an individualistic worldview of like, oh, it's just your suffering. And, once you have enough money and you've removed yourself from like the poorer neighborhoods and like you've created a life for yourself and your family, your nuclear family, then everything's fine and you just block out the rest. That's not what we're going at. To your point about like, this is overwhelming, I agree, but I think the alternative is more overwhelming. And I have personally found turning inward and learning to practice compassion as a way to then harness my power. I found that incredibly empowering, but I've also found it realistic because it gives me options, like basically practicing compassion for yourself, which we can get into like how to do that, to then harness your power. That gives me more room and more options to decide, to make choices that are nourishing for me and for my community, right? To live out my values, to live out my mission. So to me, that feels realistic. And the hellscape in some ways that we've been living through for centuries now. Ancestrally, a lot of our ancestors have been living in this hellscape of colonialism and extraction and domination for centuries, for at least the last like 7 centuries. But us in our little lifetimes, just coming face to face with a world that doesn't have compassion, that sees power as only about domination and not as being about generation, like regeneration and healing, right? That's overwhelming. So this path of compassion and generative power and starting with yourself, to me, that feels like the natural step and like a way to not just bring my agency back to myself, but also to like retain my sanity, to be honest.
Okay, there's so much in there that I love. I mean, I think the piece that you talked about around options is so true in terms of like when we're in those perfectionist modes, when we're in tunnel vision, when we're in right or wrong, or there's only one way, we're so trapped and it's so paralyzing because if we feel like there's only one way to do something, and the stakes are so high around whatever that something is, as opposed to self-compassion giving us a prism of opportunity and then feeling this sense of choice around that and curiosity around that exploration. I really want to hear some of the strategies around self-compassion. And especially because you work with folks around that like perfectionism piece. Yeah, okay. I don't want to lead the question anymore. I'll
Oh,
let you
you
take
can.
it away.
I kind of want to hear what you were going to say.
What I was going to say is when I talk about self-compassion with folks who have a high degree of perfectionism, and I call myself a recovering perfectionist, so 100% that was me, is that even in their kind of negotiation with themselves to be more compassionate, they're sort of like fighting with themselves around how much compassion they deserve. Right? They're like, okay, well, like, but like not that, right? Because that thing, like, I really should be able to do it. And so there's this like holding tight to this belief almost that we don't deserve it. And so I'm really curious sort of the strategies, especially with folks who maybe feel so like clenched and closed around that type of self-love.
Right. Oh, that's a good question. What's coming to my mind now is, as somebody who's lived in both the Eastern and the Western world, I mean, it's not a clear binary anymore. I acknowledge that. But there are still some fundamental differences in terms of how these different cultures shape us, and therefore our perceptions of ourselves, which is critical when you're starting to practice self compassion. You have to step away from the default mode of being and talking to yourself that you've practiced subconsciously and unconsciously your whole life, right? Stepping away from that, the metaphor I like to use for it that personally also calms me down, because I love spending time in nature, and like being with the earth is really, really helpful to start embodying compassion instead of thinking about it and like being in a more intellectual headspace with it, which is where a lot of the fighting that you mentioned happens, right? It happens in the realm of thoughts. So the metaphor that I like to share with people is practicing self-compassion. The very first step to practicing self-compassion for you can be, imagine that you are sitting by a river now, and that river is your thoughts. And you're sitting by it for the first time instead of being in it, being carried away by a very strong current of just thought after thought after thought and reaction after reaction after reaction, right? So you're just sitting by the river and you're learning to notice the river. You're learning to notice the water flowing instead of being in it and drowning. And what I discovered, for example, was I used to say things to myself regularly that I rarely or never say now. Things like, I can't do anything right. I'm so stupid. And I wasn't saying them consciously, but it was thought after thought after thought, reaction after reaction after reaction to situations and to my own thoughts. So visualizations help you do that. Even if you're not a religious or spiritual person per se, sitting down, having a visualization exercise, which I can share with you. So you can put in in the links. I have a few that are just freely available. There's lots of good ones on the internet, but visualizations that help you step back and sit by the river instead of drowning in it. Those, I would say, the first step, two steps, like first, like turn on the visualization, give it time, right? Honor it, just like honor the start, and then learn to observe your thoughts and reactions instead of identifying so closely with them.
Yes, because without that space, we just sort of think that's like some truth, right? We're like, whatever that thing is, we're like, oh, it must be true because it like showed up in my head and, unintentional, not necessarily like consciously. I love that recommendation around also like slowing down for a moment. Like, I think we have these desires to kind of fit these things into our hustle between all the millions of things we're doing. And what I hear you saying is like space. You have to create space, even if that space is a moment to close your eyes, but there has to be space between thoughts, between like, to be able to be aware of anything.
Yep, totally. And speaking of fundraising, and like one of the things that I share it with fundraisers, but even though I am not one, I do have to market, because Unearth Freedom, which is my coaching and like facilitation practice, right? Like we need to reach people so that people know what we do. And so I write emails, right? And I know y'all write emails too. And this actually, just this simple process of like having self compassion for myself and then harnessing my power, it helped me go from like literally being unable to write to people. I was too frozen to tell people what I did like 2.5 years ago, to just being able to get on my Mac and like write what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking, and truly trust that it's good enough and that people want to hear from me, and then just send it. right? All that drama that used to happen about like, this is not good enough. Nobody wants to hear it. You're just adding to people's junk or like clutter in their inboxes. I was able to shift my perception away from that. And like you said, not believe it as true. And I believe this impacts our communities too. It's not just like, oh, self compassion is just for you. And like I said, it's not just an individualistic pursuit. But when you shift your beliefs about your body, when you take a moment to realize that your way of talking about your body is very cruel, you don't like it and you nitpick it so much, which a lot of us do, right? When you practice self compassion, you then also are reshaping culture because you're no longer body shaming in a culture that still takes that as the default, right? And you're impacting everyone around you and saying, oh, we're not going to participate in that anymore.
I think that's such a good reminder also for like positional leaders in organizations, right? I feel like I talk about this a lot with perfectionism, where I'm like, you can say like, this is a place we can make mistakes and learn from mistakes, and you don't have to be perfect. But if your team is watching you beat yourself up when you
Yep.
make a mistake, you are communicating the culture and the value, and and so modeling self-compassion helps other people be able to try that on around you as well. And I think sometimes as leaders we think, oh, I just need to be compassionate or give my team grace but not myself, and they're watching. And part of that is exactly to your point before, it's more than just the moment of giving it to ourselves. It's also like what it does for the community and culture around us.
100%.
What do you think is like, it's so interesting what you were talking about before around your writing. And I've had some like similar kind of shifts in my journey too. And something that really hit me recently was like, I think about all the things I really criticized myself for 10 years ago. And I'm not any, better or smarter or prettier or thinner than any of the criticisms I used to give myself. And so, but I've been thinking a lot about how my confidence has changed. And for me, I think it is this like self-compassion piece and this level of acceptance around imperfection, which maybe like, I'm curious if you think that's related to like how that's related to all of this. But I think about like even that piece around writing, there's an increase of self-compassion at the same time as there's probably an increase in the tolerance for outside criticism, right? Like I get more criticism today being visible than ever before in my life. But I don't go into shame or embarrassment because I have a like self-compassion, because I have because I don't expect myself to be perfect. So when somebody's like criticizing me, I'm not like, oh my God, I should have. It's like, oh yeah, like that totally can be a blind spot for me. Like they're pointing that out, but I know that about myself and I don't hate myself because of that, because I have no expectation that I don't make mistakes. So I'm curious how you see sort of like the weave of those concepts.
Okay, yes, I love this. I feel what wants to come through right now is the way that I have conceptualized generative power. And I really love this term because I've been on this, like, I don't know, soapbox for the last 2 years or so. But I've obviously been thinking about this for close to a decade and more. Is when did we decide collectively that power is evil and that having power is bad? And that people with power, people in power are just going to do terrible things and decide to do terrible things on behalf of all of us. And we just kind of have to then, douse out the fire as best as we can, which don't feel like we're doing very good. And I can tell you that is the case globally, right? Not just in the US, like multiple countries are going through crises with incompetent and destructive leaders as heads of state. And I think they're practicing what's destructive power. What is available to all of us is generative power. And that's what you're talking about. Like when I hear you say, I can accept that I have a blind spot and I'm going to keep creating, that to me is you exemplifying generative power, because it literally is self-explanatory, right? Like we're meant to generate, to create as human beings, not just to produce, but to create and to care for each other collectively. And when we can leave behind the shame, the inhibitions, the self-criticism, and also the embarrassment, like other people's reactions. And maybe we don't leave it behind as much as we just integrate it so that it no longer stops us from creating. That is when I feel we're exercising our generative power. And each of us in our spheres, I feel like it's so important for us to do that. Like we can talk about living out our missions in the abstract, or we can let it become another task that like weighs over our heads and that we use to criticize ourselves. Like, am I living out my values enough or not? Or we can create in whatever form is fun and natural and productive for us, right? When we create new things, new art, new podcasts, new, newsletters, new offerings, new programs in nonprofits and in our social enterprises, when we invent things, when we solve problems, I feel like that's how we collectively progress as humanity. And so exercising our generative power, I truly feel like that's at the heart of it. That's what self-compassion allows you to be able to do. And that's a gift, not just to you, but literally to humanity. If that's what I believe.
Okay, that is the perfect note to end this on. I'm so grateful for your time. I can't believe I feel like I blinked and we're at time, but I'm so grateful for this. I would love it if you'd be willing to share a visualization that we could put in the show notes for folks to check out and learn more about you and your work. Is there anything else you wanted to direct folks to today or tell them about?
So I'm hosting a Take Your Power Back workshop. I will be doing a visualization in it. It's only $15 and it's on August 25th. So if this comes out after that date, I'm sure I'll be doing another one. And the best one that folks can stay updated and connected with me is through my email community. So I'll share the link with you for that and they can join us. They'll hear about the workshops and I'll also share the visualization with you.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure talking to you. I loved it. Thank you.